again to Theories of Reality. I'm from Borrowdale, and we're talking some more about free will. We'll finish our section on free will today, and then the exam will open right after class, be based on life after death and these arguments about free will. So, did you have a question about
You just answered it.
Okay, excellent.
Got to turn on the mic.
And welcome yet again to Theories of Reality. I'm Professor Borrowdale, and we're going to talk some more about the free will problem, get into talking about compatibilism, which is an attempt to solve the free will dilemma that will preserve both the idea of moral responsibility and also concessions to modern science. So we'll see how that fares. And then right after class, the exam will be available. It will be based on both the first, so it will be based on just the life after death material and free will. And then for the final exam, we'll just be talking about arguments for and against the existence of God and the meaning of life. All right, so free will. Oh, by the way, the exam deadlines, the dates are in the syllabus. They're also in Moodle if you click on the exam. I think you have a little more than a week to take it this time. I think, what is this week? Actually, I think I actually had it due Tuesday of next week, so I can double check on it during the break. So again, you have about a week to take it. You don't have to jump in there today and do it, but if you would like to, it's available after class. Okay, let's talk about free will some more. So last time we were talking about the determinist and libertarian views on free will. So remember, free will is the power to have done otherwise under identical circumstances. The determinists say we do not have that power, that whatever we do is a result of previous causes. And they have various arguments in favor of this view. So, like, what are some of the things determinists say will rule out free will that cause us to do what we do?
Was it the subconscious?
Subconscious, right? We talked about that last time. So there's the psychoanalytic argument. So let's put this up here.
You said terminus?
Determinism.
Oh.
Determinism. Sorry, I swallow up the beginning of some words. Determinism. So we talked about the psychoanalytic argument. The psychoanalytic argument is the argument from the subconscious. So that's, this is Freud. So psychoanalysis is, the therapeutic technique developed by Sigmund Freud. And so psychoanalysis is specifically this sort of a way of trying to solve people's problems by finding their roots in their subconscious. So last time we talked about people in early childhood say a woman who is neglected or abused by her father will often go out and look for a man just like her father, who's alcoholic, criminal, extreme mood disorder, and both neglectful and also perhaps jealous and violent. And it seems, on the face of it, seems irrational. But if you put this person under hypnosis, you do some word association, or you get them to just lie back on the couch, and Freud would say, "Tell me about your father," right? And then, oh, my father never loved me, and he's a lot like Biff, my violent, abusive boyfriend. Sorry, right? So yeah, and so people start to put together these connections. And it's not, and that's just like one example of the ways in which people suffer childhood trauma based on parental influence, other events that can happen to you when you're a child that might make you shy or give you a social phobia, and also there are positive things too. So you see people are super ambitious, for example. I gave the example of like some kid that, at a pivotal moment, hits the winning home run in the baseball game and feels like he's king of the world and he can do anything. And maybe like at that moment, his coach, who's sort of like a father figure, puts his hand on his shoulder and said, you did good, son. You can do anything you put your mind to. And that like sticks down in his subconscious mind. So that's an example of positive programming. And we tend not to think about those things. We tend to focus on the negative things because they come out with like dysfunctional behavior, like that, the school shooter, right? The guy obviously had a lot of issues, and you see him with the crazy-eyed stare, right? And Freud would say, if you look back to his childhood, he was, so I guess he was adopted. So there's ostensibly some reason why his parents gave him up for adoption, and then perhaps some conflicts about him being adopted. And then right before the shooting, his mother died, and then years before that, his father also was dead. So those things can be super traumatic, particularly when you're growing up. I think the father died about 10 or 12 years previous. So those things lodge down in your subconscious mind when your personality is forming, and then cause trouble later on in life. The problem is that your subconscious mind isn't rational. Like, it's not rational to think, if I can get this jerk of a boyfriend to love me, he'll be a proxy for my father who never loved me. It'll be like having my father love me. It doesn't make any rational sense to do that, but the subconscious mind is all about like associations and proxies and substitutions, where you can't have this thing that you want, and so you go after this other thing that or maybe there's something like, if your father's dead, for example, or you're alienated, your subconscious mind is looking for a quick fix of something that's similar to that's going to be a substitute. And you get lots of examples of the substitution behavior too, of unconscious drives. Can anybody else think of like a unconscious drive that would drive someone to do something or not do something? Things people have bubbling, down below the threshold of ordinary, what things they're aware of. Like, suppose, what happens if you have like super strict parents and they're always telling you what to do, and ever since you're like a kid, you never got to eat like the sugary cereals that your friends got to eat. It was like bran flakes and skim milk, and you had to be home at 3 o'clock every day and do your homework before dinner. If you stepped out of line, you were severely punished. You had like a 9 o'clock curfew, and the parents had to know where you were at all times. And so imagine that's your upbringing.
I've seen this way too many times.
What happens if say you go off to college on your own? How do people like this typically behave?
I can do all these things now.
Yeah.
I do it all.
Yeah, so that's what Freud called repression, right? So you learn, like, if you try, and maybe if you stay out too late, you get severe punishment, right? So you're not powerful enough to fight back against your parents and to resist them. And so what happens, you have all this internalized anger and rage and pent-up frustration, right? Mm-hmm. And so often what happens is, even when you have kids who are they're raised by strict parents, and they end up becoming delinquents because they're repressed so heavily, they go out and they start stealing cars and getting in trouble, right? And sometimes they don't really care whether they're going to get caught. And in fact, they might even want to get caught because it's going to embarrass their parents. And maybe their parents, what they care most about is putting up appearances. So if your dad is, say, the pastor of a church, or if he's a law enforcement officer, and you're engaged in delinquent behavior, that's a way of getting at it. Now, as you're going out there stealing cars, engaging in petty crime, you're not thinking, oh, I'm I'm really gonna embarrass my parents. They're gonna see, you know, that what are they gonna think when their kids are delinquents? You're just thinking you're pissed off, right? But your subconscious mind down there, the wheels are going and spinning around thinking, oh, this is gonna be great. You know, my parents were all about like putting up appearances, and dad, who's Mr. Law and Order, his son's gonna end up in his own jail, and then what is he gonna do? And won't that really stick it to him? But consciously you're thinking, I'm bored, I think I'm just gonna go out and cause some trouble, right? So it's all happening below the level of conscious deliberation. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to like analyze your own actions and try and create an origin for it in like of your subconscious? So like almost as if it is possible to mold your own subconscious, but only if you're capable of being aware of those deeper
Yeah.
reasons. I wonder if that's actually, yeah, I would
So
say.
people do this through I mean, typically it's through therapy, but you can do it through like journaling. They've actually done a lot of studies of people that just like write out their feelings, write about their childhood, write about their formative experiences, can actually help them understand themselves and bring out things that they never realized before. You see this with people with eating disorders too. It's where they're like what they eat is heavily restricted as a kid, and they're pissed off about it, and so they end up like and then they're made to go to bed at a certain time and so on. So as an adult, even like middle-aged people, you know, they have no self-restraint. They balloon up to 300 pounds. They don't keep regular hours, and then they end up with like a mood disorder because of all the internalized anger, and then they suffer from depression, and then they get on disability because they can't, you know, function because their sleep's all whacked out and because they got health problems related to their obesity. And then they say, and then they spend all their time on Tumblr where people that suffer their same problems like validate them, and they become like a victim becomes their identity. And it's an excuse to avoid responsibility, right? And they don't think, oh, well, they don't think I'm still, this is really weird. Why am I still rebelling against my parents when I'm 50 years old, right? They don't think that. They think, oh, you know what, my life sucks, and it's too bad I was born with something wrong with my brain. And so that becomes like sort of, this is what the psychoanalysts talk about, an elaborate facade of rationalizations for your behavior. So consciously you think, I feel crappy all the time. I can't sleep, I have no control over my appetite, I'm on these psychotropic drugs, the government is paying me to be disabled and to be incompetent, so I guess I better fulfill that role, because God, what would happen if like I had to like, you know, take care of myself? That would be too much for me after the years and years of like being dependent. So this weird sort of cluster of dysfunctional behavior is all rooted in the subconscious desire to throw off the structure imposed by a parent when you're young. But you don't see it that way. You see it in terms of all these other things you've built up to try to explain or excuse your behavior. And so that's another example like that side. So if you go into therapy and start talking about your father and your mother and the rules growing up, and I know someone who, let's see, so people that have like super like messy environments. Think about like my office, right? Maybe there's a story to tell. But I know someone, not myself, who had their mother had they had this so they had to do chores of cleaning things, and they had like this like a, I don't know what you call it, a character, the mean maid. It was just like a stick figure, and it was like the mean maid gets upset if you don't clean your room because then she has to do it. So you know the mean maid is obviously a thinly veiled allusion to mom, right? So as you know, the mean maid wants you to clean your room. You know, this picture of this stick figure with like a cross look on her face, and with a bunch of boxes of all the different things you got to do and check them off, right? So what do you, when that person grows up and they're living on their own, what do you think their house is going to look like? It's going to be pandemonium, right? It's going to be piles of newspaper, up to the ceiling. It'll be like, it'll just be a complete disaster because this person has a structure imposed on them and gets upset about it. And again, they might not draw the connection at all between those two things. But if they get the therapy, they can see, okay, this is why I'm doing this. And once they bring that to conscious awareness, then they're able to say, well, maybe actually I would feel better if I cleaned up a little bit and made things a little more livable where I can find things and the environment's more pleasant. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm depressed. Yeah.
Well, it seems like what you really keep tapping on is parents trying to be parents. And that's obviously such a hard thing to do, but how would you say a parent could teach a child without imposing all these subconscious bad effects to where it just ends up them being having issues in life? Why is it that couldn't be taken as a skill? Hey, you should be cleaning these things because it'll be good for you. Do you think it's a lack of explanation, poor teaching skills, lack of? I purely think it's lack of explanation. But what do you think?
Yeah, it seems like that's part of it. Kids like to help, and I remember when I was a camp counselor and I did day camp, and we're we had one of the things we had to do was clean up our cabin, and we made it into a competition with the other cabins. It was fun. The kids were they were falling over each other and fighting over the broom who gets to sweep the cabin, right? So there are ways to try to incentivize people.
Yeah.
It's I think about that scene from Tom Sawyer. Is that Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn? I think it's Tom Sawyer, where he's painting the fence, and he ends up he has to paint this fence and it's drudgery, so he convinces his friends about how fun painting the fence is, and pretty soon they're standing in line to pay him to help him paint the fence. Right, so that might be. That's part of creative parenting, I suppose.
Yeah. And
one of the things that I suppose that's come out of this psychoanalysis, and maybe things have gone the opposite way, but if you oppose an authoritarian structure on kids, they don't learn to do things for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just as bad as coddling the kids and doing everything for them, right? So you have
it's a happy medium.
Yeah, so kids will say this, if you do everything for them, at a certain point they'll maybe push back and say, let me do it, right? Kids want to do things for themselves, but if you continually coddle them and give them rules to say they can't do certain things, and then do a lot of other things for them, they're going to be dependent and helpless.
Yeah.
But if you're strict and impose a structure on them, they never learn they never learn self-discipline because discipline's imposed from the outside.
Gotcha.
So
the self is what develops the self.
Yeah, so it's about internalizing these rules, and Freud might not have totally understood this. Freud thinks you're just told you're bad and wrong and don't, and if you do it too much, a person ends up with neuroses where they feel guilty all the time and don't know why. But there's also there's ways to where people can internalize certain ideas that it's nice to have a clean environment. I know how to take care of myself. I care about keeping my teeth healthy, so I'm going to brush them every night and make that part of my routine. Routines are good, right? And so the structure, it comes from within and it's seen as reinforcing. So anyway, that's one of the now what Freud will say. Or I'll say what the determinists will say about psychoanalytic theory is where is the room for free will? And it's saying that psychoanalysts say it's not just these few cases of neurotic behavior, it's everything. And we just don't notice the ones that are positive, but you're going around all the time and there are all these primal urges for sex and food and power and control over your environment. And there's the id, these primitive desires, along with the superego, all these internalized rules, and they're duking it out. And sometimes it comes, there's big conflicts. Sometimes there's smaller ones, but this fight between the id and the superego is always going on, and you have no awareness of it. And what you think is the reason for what you do isn't really the reason for what you do. And that seems pretty important for free will. If you say, well, I'm going to pick, so you think about the really important decisions who you're gonna pick as a mate, how you look at relationships, what you're gonna do for a career. I mean, those are really big things. The psychoanalyst will say, you know, who you're picking as a mate or what you're doing as a career is all based on the subconscious stuff that you're not aware of. Or your patterns of behavior and your basic personality is all, again, based on these things that happen to you and the way you reacted to them. And so when you're making a free will decision, like you're deliberating, like, you know, take, you know, there's, pick a name that nobody in the class has. Gwen. So Gwen is thinking, you know, she's thinking about her next boyfriend, and she's wondering if she should go out to like the bars and try to find another jerk, or whether she, you know, should go to like the honor society meeting and try to pick like a guy who's not like all the last 5 jerks she dated, since she's an honor student, right? And maybe all the problems with her, you know, maybe she's in danger of losing her scholarship because of all the fallout from the last guy that she had to get a restraining order against. And so she's thinking, well, should I go to the honor society and maybe hit on like that sort of nerdy, shy guy who's like really attractive and would be like a perfect match? Or do I go out to the bars and have a few drinks and then, you know, go home with the guy that looks like who's ignoring me? and she makes a deliberation. She's like, honor society boring, and those guys are just totally boring. I'm gonna go out to the bars because and find a guy like the last one, but he'll be different. Right, so the psychoanalyst would say that's compulsive behavior, that's self-sabotaging behavior. Maybe she's got some neurotic conflict over being an honor student. Maybe she feels like she doesn't deserve it because her mother used to tell her how she was a bad girl and deserved to be punished, right? And so she has this internalized negative self-esteem, even though she's really bright. And maybe that's why she goes for these men that degrade her and abuse her, is because she feels like she deserves it. And so her subconscious mind is saying, you're bad and you deserve to be punished. Go create some conflict and chaos with some violent, abusive boyfriend, right? So, and you know, drink copious amounts of alcohol. That would probably help stir up some chaos, right? And maybe that's what she did as a little girl. She would cause trouble and try to stir up chaos to try to get back at her parents, because that was the only way she could figure out how to do that. Anyway, so when she's deciding what to do, and she's like, well, I think I'll go out and feel and what will she say? Like consciously, she'll say, well, I'll go to the honor society, and she looks over the guy that she's like thinking about talking to, and she's like, he just doesn't do anything for me. And her subconscious mind is saying, oh, that guy, he's not gonna, you don't deserve that guy. Maybe that's what like the message says. You don't deserve somebody who's functional and normal. You deserve to be degraded. And so, but that comes out in terms of like you know, romantic excitement or attachment. But she doesn't realize that it's because she has low self-esteem that she's attracted to these men that don't treat her well, right? That's not a conscious choice. And so she says, well, I feel kind of uptight and anxious, right? And maybe it's because she's actually thinking about breaking the pattern. She feels super anxious. And so she says, okay, well, I feel like really anxious. And she's thinking about going up to the guy and talk to him after the honor society thing. And she just can't do it. She gets really, really nervous because she's about to break the pattern. And so what does she choose? She goes out to the bar, has a couple of drinks to help relax, and then ends up with the same kind of guy. Now, Freud would say that's just, you know, even though she goes through the motions of deliberating and maybe tries to make a choice outside of her self-destructive pattern, it's her id and her superego that are pulling the strings there. The id that, you know, both of them are pushing her into negative patterns.
So what about people that do have healthy subconsciouses? Are they capable of making more free will types of choices than others that have a ill subconscious?
So I think that the Freudian would say, so there's people who are functional and people who are dysfunctional, but neither is more free than the other.
Interesting.
They would say like the guy who's like, you know, who's super ambitious and always seems to win, and if like the problems that, like, if he, like the person who has like some catastrophic defeat and kind of shrugs his shoulders, like, oh, well, I'll win next time. That guy is, he's go and super functional because of what happened to him. But so he's not any more, free than the person who has a dysfunctional behavior. It's just that for his functional behavior is more pleasant and fulfilling, but he isn't any more free than the other person. Then there's the subconscious, and then there's and we talked about some objections to this, right? So maybe the idea is that the Freudians overplay the subconscious. Maybe people that go into therapy, they have all these neurotic conflicts, and the subconscious has some effect, but you can reprogram the subconscious in therapy. Maybe you're within your basic personality, you're able to make a lot of choices. And your preferences and stuff, they get formed apart from your free choices. But within those preferences, there's lots of things you can choose. And over time, you can even change your preferences by doing different things. So your choices don't seem totally controlled by your subconscious, and you can work on these problems, and people do get better and solve these neurotic conflicts and make different kinds of choices and break self-defeating patterns. So then there's the other argument we talked about is the behaviorist argument. It should be psychoanalytic argument, behaviorist argument. And that's just this idea that we behave according to our environment and heredity, mostly environment, stimulus response, and that the environment causes us to behave as we do. And we talked about this sort of analogy with a person who is addicted to fast driving, say, and a person who has a seizure. And normally, I think we left off talking about moral responsibility last time, which is a libertarian argument against the behaviorist. The behaviorist will say we're all stimulus response, and the guy who plows in a bunch of school children through reckless driving is no more responsible for his actions than someone who just has a seizure unknown to him. And I think, did we leave off talking about the moral responsibility argument, the libertarian argument? Let me just, psychoanalytic behaviors. Oh, there's the argument from physics. We talked about that. This idea we live in a world of cause and effect. And so the physical world is a world of necessity where the same causes always produce the same effects. Human beings aren't outside that world, therefore we have to have our actions are necessitated by these antecedent causes, the causes that come beforehand. So same causes, same effect, and that seems to happen in a deterministic way. And then the other one we talked about was this kind of theological determinism or fate. This idea that there's some sort of cosmic order that decides what happens to us. And this is something that maybe isn't super prevalent, but at one time was. And I suppose people have this idea of inevitable fate, or God's plan for your life, or what have you. That the idea that you can't escape your fate, and so that might be that's sort of like one of the argument against determinism is this idea that the physical world doesn't determine me because I am a spiritual being. But then the theological determinists will come along and say, well, it's precisely because you're a spiritual being that your fate is sealed. So you can think about this sort of idea of the spiritual world doesn't necessarily make room for free will if the spiritual world follows some spiritual laws, or there's a God who has a will that's inescapable, who's all powerful and has set the world up in a certain way. Then we talked about the libertarian arguments, libertarianism. And we talked about indeterminism in physics. And this idea that at the quantum level, matter behaves really weird and chaotically and doesn't follow these regular laws of cause and effect. But in physics. And then there's the counter argument that can we really go from what happens inside a cloud chamber or what we think goes on inside an atom to the level at which decisions are made. It seems that even though in the micro world of particle physics, things are really weird and we can't figure out what's going to happen next, when you do a chemistry experiment, you always get the same result. And it seems that your brain being a macro 2.5 pound lump of matter is part of like the world that fits in more with chemistry. And all the weird quantum physics stuff doesn't change the result of your chemistry experiment. So you might argue that these little micro anomalies don't affect the level at which decisions are made in your brain. And then the other question is about whether it's just random, right? So could it be random?
That's the gap that science is trying to solve, though. The tie between micro and macro.
Mm-hmm. So
Unified theory.
Right.
That's
yeah.
it.
Yep. And then there's the question about whether so it's the micro to macro, and that seems the questionable. Oops. Macro. Yeah. Macro. And then there's the question about whether it just be random, right? So what does this mean? Where there's this thing called Tourette's syndrome, where people just seemingly randomly, will have like nervous tics.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about like a nervous tic. Is that the model you want for free will, where like every once in a while you kind of go like this? I had a woman. She had Tourette's, and she was talking to me, and to put me at ease, she said, she's like, don't mind my nervous tics and twitches. That's just my Tourette's. She's talking to me. She's kind of like her head was like constantly moving, twitching, and moving. And some people with Tourette's, as they'll just like shout out swear words. Like, it's really tough when you're like, in a busy restaurant or something like that. And it's just it's involuntary, right? It's, is it free will? Like if you sit on the table and the doctor takes a mallet and hits your, knee and it goes up, is that free will? What if it only goes up half the time? Does that mean it's free will? So it seems like that's not the model you want for free will. In some sense, it has to be something chosen by you. And this argument from particle physics that it's made by, what's his name? Karl Popper makes this argument that because things in particle physics are random, that makes room for free will. He goes back to Democritus, who says, every once in a while, for no particular reason, an atom swerves, it zigs when it should have zagged, and that makes room for free will. That doesn't really seem to help you out, because that just makes it seem like your action to be random. Where it seems like to be free, an action has to be part of your character, it has to be based on your preferences and choices.
Would freedom be selecting from random? Would free choice be the ability to decipher from random and to pick a specific choice?
Well, I guess there's ideas of a bunch of
like
different choices, and the question on what basis are they chosen. If it's just random, if it's like rolling the dice, then that doesn't seem like it's free. So it seems that there has to be like you choosing it. But then the question is, on what basis did you make that choice? So did you have a reason? Yes, okay. Well, that reason, the determinist will say, was the cause of your action. Did you do it for no reason whatsoever? Then it's just random, right? So it's kind of this weird. So you think about here's did you do it for a reason.
What's our working definition for random?
Yeah, what is random?
I feel like random might mean just like.
Not
method
causally
to
determined. So here, like if you did it for the reason, the reason is the cause. And then if you didn't do it for a reason, it would just be random. So yes. So this would be yes. And this will be no. Then it's random, right? So if you ask someone like, why did you punch that guy? Oh, I just felt like it, right? But why him in particular? No reason whatsoever. I was just, feeling angry, and so I just like punched some random person. Or if the person, you ask them, why did you punch that guy? And they say, oh, I don't know. I just sort of like, I had a blackout, right? and I found, blood on my knuckles. But if you ask, like, why did you punch that person? And he said, he insulted my mother or something, right? Then, or he was a Nazi or whatever. Like, people say he has a reason. Well, then that reason is going to be what caused him to do that. You think about, why is that guy punching Nazis? Well, it's because, he's the Antifa. Why is he Antifa? Well, it's because his mother never loved him, and he's like a loser living in his parents' basement. Has a bunch of pent-up frustration about being a loser in life's lottery. Right, so
Does that mean he punches every Nazi or just that Nazi?
Yeah, why that one in particular? Or it might be like,
Nazi
the guy was like, maybe he looked like it wasn't too big, and the guy was like distracted, and he thought he could get away with it or something.
So
Right?
it wasn't exactly.
Nazi bam.
Right, but they will say, like, as soon as you say, well, I did this for a determinate reason, then, why did you do that action? Well, you wanted to. Why did you want to do that? Well, you have certain sets of preferences, certain sets of desires, and then there's your current environment, which determines, like, whether you can realize those desires. There's maybe a certain element of heredity, so it's your like your temperament, your personality, and that some of that seems to be heredity. Like how good you are at how impulsive you are, and also how good you are at figuring out how to get what you want. And so that's intelligence. That's also largely genetic. So it's like genetics. So they'll say like heredity and environment, and along with culture, right? So that's part of your environment, the cultural context of your action. And these things are going to determine your action, right? As soon as you say you had a reason for it, that's an action. Now, what do you think about this as an argument? Like, if you have a reason for anything you do, that reason's going to be cashed out in terms of like some goal you had. And the question is, well, why did you have that goal? Well, because it seems like it traces back to some desire. Why did you have that desire? Well, it's either going to be your past life history, your preferences, your personality. Most of that stuff's not stuff that you chose. Or it's kind of like a series of choices you made, going back to your earliest choices.
So the randomness is just like what we, like a method too complicated to understand, like the genealogy of its cause and effect.
So I suppose with
Not
this,
really
the random, like you look at the like argument from people like Popper, he says sometimes people act out of character. They do something for no particular reason. That shows that they're free. Because if they were determined, we'd be able to predict everything they did, and there would be no random actions. But it seems like even if there are random actions, it doesn't help you out for being free. Because a random action is something that that your body does, your brain does. It's not something that you consciously choose.
So I guess I'm saying that there is no free will, it's all determined, because like even if we think it's random, it's not random. It's just too complicated to decipher a direct lineage of the cause and effect.
Well, I think that so you could go two ways. You could say that that everything's determined, or you'd say that some things are random. If you say everything's determined, then there's no free will. If you say some things are determined and some things are just random, not that we can't figure out what they are, but they're just like generally random. They're not determined by previous causes.
I just don't think anything in the universe just happens, though. There's always like a preceding cause to affect that.
So there are causes, but the causes don't determine the effect. So and maybe that's what so the random means that the causes don't they don't determine this particular effect.
Or they're just missing pieces of information to get to that conclusion.
Okay, so that's the idea that everything's determined. We just our knowledge is imperfect. But this is a different idea, right? So I mean I can see like people will argue, like the libertarians will argue that the determinists will argue that everything is determined, and there's some cases where we wonder like, well, why did that guy do that thing when we expect him to do this other thing? And they'd say, well, there's got to be some cause, we just don't know what it is, right? So that's the determinist argument. The libertarian would say that shows that he's free. You couldn't predict it, so that shows that he could have gone one way or the other.
So I think libertarians are just making an excuse for like their lack of information. I think they're just a little.
But it seems like you're like, how is that not begging the question? It seems like you're assuming determinism is true, and therefore the libertarians are just making excuses for not accepting determinism.
Yeah, I think they have an epistemological like issue in their philosophy.
And I suppose that maybe the argument is like the people who believe in free will, they want to hold on to moral responsibility, and they also want to hold on to things like human dignity and the power for self-determination, and they think it has to do with like the meaning of life and like lots of other values. Whereas the determinist wants to hold fast to like the scientific worldview and thinks that free will is tries to throw a monkey wrench into this idea that.
Would it be a fallacy to like work so hard to maintain the desired goal of maintaining morality? Might that be a fallacy in their way of like navigating their
Yeah, you might argue that it's illegitimate that they want to hold on to this idea of morality.
If it was true, they would just end up with it in the end as a byproduct versus like trying to route their method to that specific answer.
But that wouldn't necessarily be all like libertarians are just trying to maintain this belief in morality. But that's one of the motivations. They say, well, if everything's determined, then how could people be responsible for their actions? Like, you would look at like the school shooter, right? You'd say, well, some people say he's just evil, and other people say, well, something went wrong with his brain, and we should study him to try to figure out see how it doesn't happen again. But even that is just sort of like. So I suppose I say we shouldn't be concerned about blaming and punishing the school shooter. We should be trying to understand what went wrong with him, right? And as a determinist, I believe that public policy should be focused on creating better mental health outcomes with early intervention into crisis situations. Well, so I'm making a prescription, right? I'm suggesting other people adopt a policy. But isn't that assuming that I want people to make a choice, and a free choice for one policy as opposed to another? Aren't I like urging people to make a certain choice?
And would the timeline be different if it wasn't chosen? Because if it's predetermined, then that means no matter what decision is made, certain events will happen.
Well, the idea is that whatever, que sera, sera, what will be, right? That's the determinist idea, that things can only happen one way. Like, given all the circumstances right now, that things can only turn out one way.
So they don't believe in like a multiverse or different timelines. That's.
I mean, it's not really. I don't think that's compatible with determinism. Now, it might fit with this sort of like the idea of like those sort of random causes, or it could be just like people make different choices and they create different realities. But I think the determinists will say there's really they'll say there aren't any ways that things could have been that are different than how things turned out. Right, so it might seem like that because you can like look at possibilities in the future, and it seems like there's a possibility of I don't know, like, it might seem there's a possibility of like new gun control legislation, or there's a possibility of new mental health interventions, or is the possibility of both of those things happening in the wake of this latest school shooting. Or there's a possibility of like armed guards at, you know, schools or whatever. But those seem like all things that could happen or could not happen. The determinists will say, that's based on your imperfect knowledge. Only one thing is gonna happen, and whatever happens, it had to happen.
Okay, so determinism believes that every event is just going to happen no matter what choices are made. But let's say that we were somehow capable of tracking every single particle's movement from the beginning of time.
I think we would be determined. I think it'd be predestined.
Yeah, but what would have been the action to cause all of that predetermination?
Big Bang, so it wasn't like,
Yeah, but then,
it
like,
wasn't creationism. It wasn't like,
yeah, whatever it was, what was that first deciding factor? Because if you think about it, there has to be a decision made for a possible reality to exist, right?
So I guess
Why?
that begs the question.
Well,
Decision is the term,
like
like
decisions
determinists
are
will-
made, and that's what gives the outcome, right?
Well, no, determinists will say decisions like something the human brain does. That's determined like everything else. But before, you know, the Big Bang, there were no brains, there was no consciousness, there was just
But could you still say like
matter.
movements are a way of determining something?
Mm,
Like whether
so-
a particle moves to the left or to the right? Would that
Right, but that's
change?
not, that's different from a decision now, I think they would say.
I know, I'm just trying to track it back all the way to the point where it's like, well, maybe it is true. Like, if we did have all of that information of all the predeterminants,
Could it
then
then be
that's
free
where free will doesn't actually exist, is because there was
Well, that's.
that beginning maybe decision and then all these reactions to.
The first day we started out talking about free will, I talked about this idea, like what if you knew every fact about the present moment? You
Yeah.
knew all the laws of physics, you know the position of every atom, you knew
Yeah.
everything about the present moment. You're omniscient just about like this particular second in time. So if determinism is true, you could predict all future events, and you could also know all past events.
Yeah.
If you don't think that's possible, then you think determinism is false. But like the determinist hypothesis is that everything that happens has to happen. It happens of necessity, and any possibility of something other than what happens happening is an illusion.
Hmm.
Whereas the libertarians say the future is open, that you could make some choices or other choices. Those will have, you know, those will determine, they might like constrain future choices. So if you make a choice to do one thing today, it might cut off choices of doing something else in the future.
Are we free from choice? Because like to not choose is also a choice to not choose.
Right, yeah, so I suppose not doing something, you know, could result in you know,
Still being a choice.
positive or
So
negative
that's why I'm
consequences
still
too.
on the free will side. Just because that making those decisions can restrict other decisions. Like,
Mhm.
I don't know.
I think
The question is your past predetermine you to
Yeah.
pick out of a selection of choices in that moment. Versus like if she went through, if she had the same situation at the same time, her past would dictate probably a different sequence of even choices where you have like one choice that might be the same in both your brains, but ultimately there's still 4 separate choices upon
Yeah.
which you guys could take. So I mean like, it seems like there's free will because she would have made 2 separate choices that you didn't even conceive of, but she was still not free to choose outside of those 3 choices that she saw available.
I mean, I guess our free will is always going to be predisposed to survival. You know, so I mean that also has a very huge factor.
What
over
about
it.
suicide?
Okay, we're going into the weeds here. Let's take a break and we'll
Debate begins.
get back to him and talk some more about free will, get into compatibilism.
Yeah, it's your free will to end the timeline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Baller at it, because I used to do it
It's
all the
so
time as a
fun.
kid.
It was so fun, because my mom had me take it.
Make
'cause
arrangements for
I made
flower
arrangements
show.
for her wedding. Oh, the heart is making me pretty.
I think we're back.
Good
So,
use of saliva.
let's talk about the, get back to libertarianism. And then we'll talk about compatibilism. So we talked about the argument from indeterminism in physics. Seems like it's a loser because you can't really take these things from, weird things from quantum physics and work them into the level at which decisions are made. And it seems like even if you could, your actions would be random and they wouldn't be free. And then there's the arguments from moral responsibility. And this one, it seems, really is intuitively convincing. And this is one of those cases, kind of like you might think about this as being like a reductio ad absurdum arguments. This is moral, oops, let's try that again. Moral.
Isn't reducto because of this, that?
That's post hoc fallacy, post hoc ergo proctor hoc. Responsibility.
That was the worst.
The reductio argument is sort of this idea that if you show an argument leads to an absurdity, or it implies something that's logically false, then the argument has to be mistaken, right?
Gotcha, yeah.
So if I have, if my argument, I'm trying to think of like, you see these in political context a lot of times. I'm trying to think of like a non-political reductive argument. That's not like the ontological argument for God's existence, which we'll talk about later on. But at least that there's this idea that if you follow an argument and implies something that's false, then there's got to be some mistaken premise. There's either a problem with the logic of the argument, or there's a premise that's false. If the conclusion is false, right? You can't have a really good argument where the conclusion is false. So if a supposed fact implies something that's false, that fact isn't really a fact at all, if it logically implies something that's false. And the idea is that moral responsibility is something that we, that it's sort of, it's something that we know exists. Like this idea that there's a right and there's a wrong, and that people are responsible for their actions is a given, and we operate every day as if it were true. And nobody really doubts moral responsibility. Like every time you have like, so suppose some like professor gives you a bad grade on an English paper because they don't like your politics. And you say, this is an outrage and I've been treated unfairly, right? So that all assumes this idea of moral responsibility, that your professor was, not living up to their duties as an impartial, member of the academy, that you didn't get the grade you deserved, right? All those ideas like what you deserve, being treated fairly, those are all moral concepts. If you're a determinist, you'll say, well, your professor is a big left-winger, and he has sort of a feeling of entitlement that he wants to punish the people that don't agree with them, and he sees his beliefs as being like objective and true in every way because he lives in a liberal bubble, and and he's sort of gets and then there's the polarized political world we live in, right? So all those things, the determinists will say, lead him to downgrade students who don't agree with his politics, and they would say that things couldn't have turned out any other way. It's not as if he could have graded you fairly, given his personality, his makeup, the context of all his experiences, the fact that he was never properly disciplined as a child. Turns out to him having this sort of wild left-wing views and trying to impose it on students through his stringent grading policies against perceived right-wingers, right? So there's a story to tell, which will tell you why things couldn't turn out any other way. But most people will say, no, what that guy did was wrong, and I'm going to report him to the department chair, right? And he did something wrong. He could have graded me fairly, but he didn't. And that's that. And that you can think about this for anything. Like even when you're like driving traffic, and there's like a big black truck who's doing like 10 miles over the speed limit, and he doesn't have his lights on. Or I saw some guy today. He had his flashers on. He accidentally turned on his hazards. And people are like moving around him and trying to figure out what's going on. He's driving too slow, and he's got his hazards on, and people are expecting some kind of, that they don't know what's going on. He's causing trouble, and I think the guy just accidentally hit his hazards, and then after a while figures it out. I'm like, that guy's an idiot. He should pay more attention, right? People that are driving distractedly, not paying attention, people that merge in the freeway at 35 miles an hour. You think that person needs to learn how to drive, right? You make judgments about this all the time, about some guy who's got like the bass up so high in his car it's rattling your teeth, or just like think about all the little annoying things that people did today and how you judge them as being bad and wrong, right? Or think about like somebody that your best friend who's stabbing you in the back by stealing your boyfriend or girlfriend, by ratting you out when you got busted by the cops. Whatever it is, right? Maybe there's people get mistreated, and then they cast a moral judgment. Or let's get away from the negativism and think about like positive examples. Think about the people who helped you, that stranger who stopped by the side of the road to help you when your car had broken down. That warm fuzzy feeling you got when maybe you did something to help someone. Right? You think, oh, I used to, maybe you stopped by the side of the road because there was somebody who was out there and their car ran out of gas, and they were like a homeless person. Had this happen to me. There was this woman who had like stalled by the side of the road on the freeway, and she had a gas can in her hand. And so I pulled over and took her to the gas station and went around and made a big circle and come back so she could get gas in her car so she could get to wherever she was, parking for the night. And I felt like I did a good deed. I was a good Samaritan. I gave myself moral credit for that. And so that's all a bunch of nonsense according to the determinists, right? I did what I was determined to do. I didn't really have any choice in the matter. I'm acting on the basis of my socialization and environment and subconscious urges and whatever else, right? the very molecules themselves compelled me to do what I did. I had no choice in the matter. So this idea that I get moral credit is just part of this series of causes, and it's kind of an illusion, right? I did what was inevitable, which I was necessitated to do. So how can I claim moral credit for it?
So like on that day, certain events had
Led up to that point to where you helped that lady. But the before events could have been more positive, and so your brain was in a more giving mood, however you define that with chemicals. But in those certain situations where you do have an awful day, all these bad things happen to you, your brain is in not a helpful type of chemical mood.
Right.
So I mean, is that kind of what you're saying as well with like determinism?
Yeah, I think what the determinists will say is that, like, there are lots of different causes that make you do what you do, and that might be one. Like, people who are in unresourceful states tend to make more selfish decisions.
Yeah.
So if I was late for some event, or if I was like upset about something, I might not want to help. Help. It happened of necessity. And that you deserve blame for the actions you did, and maybe should bear some guilt and responsibility for the bad things you did, is all hinges on this idea that you were free. The reason why it's the reason why you should feel guilty and blame yourself, and or why other people should blame you or hold you responsible for your actions, is because you didn't have to do those things. You had a choice, and you made a choice to do something that you knew was wrong, and therefore you're morally culpable for it, and you perhaps deserve punishment, or at least you deserve to have moral blame cast upon you. Whereas if you did a good thing, you deserve moral credit for those things. All that's rendered unintelligible with the idea that you just did whatever you did of necessity, right? You don't praise a robot for doing what it's programmed to do. And so if you're acting of necessity, you can neither be blamed or praised for what you did. Now, you mentioned like this sort of idea of being an unresourceful state. And so like if you're upset about something, you're less likely to help others. And that seems like it's true. And that's why like people who are upset about, I don't know, they're stressed out or anxious about something, they tend to say snap at people, right? Yeah. So they have harsh words, because they're upset about something else, and then somebody says, is there anything wrong? And they say, nothing's wrong, right? And they say it like that, and they lash out at people. Or in extreme cases, you get some guy, he ends up with like trouble at work and goes home and kicks the dog and beats his wife, right? So that's that, and the determinists will say that that's dysfunctional behavior. It's bad for the dog, it's bad for the wife, let's try to fix it. But it's not like he had a choice in the matter. And it's not, you shouldn't blame him and tell him he's bad and wrong. You should get him counseling and try to get him to do something, have like a better outlet for his aggression.
So it's more based on like the individual rather than the action. Because like some people, like video games, some people rage at video games all the time, and some people didn't faze them. Never has,
Yeah, and I think the determinists will say that's just people have different psychological makeups.
So it's more based on the identity.
Well, the determinists will say your identity is something which is formed by your environment and your heredity. Okay. Yeah. Whereas, like the libertarian will say, like you can form your identity. Like, how do you become a thief? Well, you steal that first thing, and then after a while it becomes a pattern, and you become a thief eventually. But those are all free choices, and you can choose to reform. So this is an argument that without the idea there is moral responsibility, therefore any theory that says that there isn't, there's something wrong with it. And this is kind of closely related to this idea of regret. Think about, like, you're bring up some traumatic memory, but think about something you did or didn't do and you regret it. Like most of the time people actually, it turns out, particularly like later in life, they mostly regret the things they didn't do, more so than the things they did do. So
I think it's because they didn't know the outcome. When they do choose to do something, they know, oh, well, that was the outcome. But when you don't choose anything, you don't know the outcome, so you don't know that timeline.
yeah.
And we like mystery.
But people think, oh, if only I had done X when I was young, or if only I had done this, if only I had invested a small amount of money. Now sometimes people like regret things they did, like, you know, if only I hadn't made that bad investment and blew all my money on, you know, something that was sketchy or something. But typically, people later in life, they make peace with the decisions that they did make that turned out badly, but they get really vexed about the things that they didn't do. So think about that when you're thinking about making a choice and thinking do something that maybe is a little bit risky. You know, don't go crazy, but think about, okay, well, maybe I should take more risks, particularly when I'm younger, because I'll have less to regret later on. That's what the psychologists will say anyway. That
I think a big note also to that thought is being capable of seeing where your actions can lead. And I think the better someone is at seeing where their actions can lead, the longer they can perceive that timeline, the more successful they'll be in decision making.
that seems to be the case too. Like if you sort of look at all the different factors and try to figure out if I do what I have this goal, how can I sort of line up things to get there. So when things turn out badly though, or when you could have done something and you didn't do it, you feel bad about it, right? So what is that? Why do you feel bad about things turning out badly?
Because I think everybody tries to strive to be their best self.
Um,
But it's really hard to define that because they don't know the futures.
well, but it seems like it's a difference between like how things. So how things could have been.
Yeah.
Right, and how things are, right? And there's this idea, there's this big difference. Like, I could have been a contender, right? You know, you could have told that special someone how you felt on Valentine's Day, and now the opportunity has passed you by, and they're with Biff, right? Or you could have done. I think about things that people regret. Besides, broken romances. I don't know, like you could like I could have been more studious in high school and I'd be at Harvard now, right? Or I could have spent more time with my aged grandparent before she passed away, right? So people have lots of regrets about things that they didn't do. Sometimes things they did do. Right, so, I wish I hadn't racked up all these student loans, right? So, people regret things, but why do you feel bad about things? It's not just because they turned out bad, but the things that really like get under your skin are those things where you had a choice and you made the wrong choice, and you think if only I had done this other thing, I wouldn't have this really bad thing happen to me, right? So it's this idea that things could have been different, but they weren't. But that assumes free will. So I could have put my phone on silence, but I didn't. And now I'm publicly embarrassed. And I can't even figure out how to.
Just click the volume up. Yeah. I mean, it's always a negative thing. Like, if a decision is confronted and you make the wrong decision, but down in your life something extremely positive happens to you, why don't people view, it's probably a good thing I didn't choose that, because what if I would have chosen otherwise, then I may not have been gifted with this wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, so that's
I feel like that's
like
the
other
optimistic
side,
view.
yeah.
There's the pessimist and the optimist.
There's a famous parable called the story of maybe, about this this farmer, and he has a field, and it's like, trampled by wild horses, and that's seen as bad. But then the wild horses, he could his son trains them, and then they're going to sell the horses, and that's good. And then the son is riding one of the horses one day, and he falls off and breaks his leg. That's bad. But then the army comes in and is looking for conscripts, and they can't take him because he's got a broken leg and he's laid up. And there's a big war, and everybody dies, but the son survives. Yeah. And each time people come to the farmer and they say, "Oh, what terrible misfortune!" And he says, "Maybe." And then they say, "Oh, what great fortune you've had, maybe." Right, so that's the sort of idea that there's
That's sketchy.
that you really, it's hard sometimes to judge whether things are good or bad based on the circumstances. But if you give long enough time, it's easy to see that things turn out badly and you made a bad choice, and it really, it bothers people that they think about. People get PTSD over like choices they made. Why? Because they think things could have turned out differently. But if determinism is true, it's things only could have turned out one way, right? And if you embrace the determinist viewpoint, you can kind of relax and you say, well, I could have made any other choice. That's given where I was at the time and what my beliefs were and what my experience was. I didn't know any better. I couldn't have chosen anything else. And if you do that, the sting of regret sort of evaporates. But it seems like that sting that regret has, more so than like any kind of misfortune, shows like this belief in free will is super deep and basic part of our experience. But then the question comes, is that based on, so the term is going to say regret is based on basically a belief in free will, right? So they'd say you got it backwards, that the reason you're all so upset about those things that you thought you could have done or didn't do is because you're laboring under the illusion of free will. And so that's why it really bothers you never told that girl how you felt about you in junior high, how you felt about her in junior high. Maybe you'd be like living in Texas, married to a Catholic soccer mom with 3 kids or whatever. Like, you think that would have been great. That she's the one that got away, right? So you'd like beat yourself up over the fact that you're shy and awkward. If you just realize that, you had a passive father and a domineering mother, and that's made you shy, particularly around women, and so it's understandable that you never told her how you felt, and that was based on your psychology and your upbringing and your temperament and all these things. And look at your twin brother, he's the same way, right? And so you like look at all the causes, and you think, well, that's how things turned out, and they couldn't have turned out any other way. And then you're not going to be worried about so much. And so they'd say that the sting that regret has is based on the illusion of free will. And it's also like morality is also based on that too. And so if you give up your belief in free will, then you can sort of start thinking more in terms of like, I suppose better choices. Now, the problem with determinism is it seems that it's sort of guilty of inconsistency. So, charge of inconsistency. So, see what you think about this. The term is just saying, since there's no free will, we should do, oops, we should do. Such and such. So what's wrong with that? Since there's no free will, we should get beyond freedom and dignity, and instead of thinking about punishing criminals, we should try to rehabilitate them. Since there's no free will, we shouldn't be so hung up on blame and praise or morality. We should think in terms of appropriate and inappropriate behavior, functional and dysfunctional behaviors.
What if you could wipe your memory?
Oh, this sounds like a tangent.
Sort of.
I want to stick with this
Like
question,
prisoner
though.
wipes his memory. Is he capable of making free will choices because now he doesn't have to be confronted with his subconscious? Is memory what dictates? I mean, I feel like that would
Yeah.
be a perfect study right there to prove whether. No, maybe. I don't know.
Would he know? But I mean, you wipe out all his memories. Does he know how to use language? Does he, you know?
Yeah, the basics. Yeah, you could say all of his memories from like his child.
What about his personality and his character, right? Because that's part of your decisions.
No
too.
personality, no character, nothing. Just physical skills.
Then on what basis would he make a decision? That's
Probably survival. Yeah.
so that, and that just seems like the survival is just programmed in. That's just instinct, along with like some means and reasoning, I suppose. I want to come back to this question though. I mean, determinists say this all the time. You libertarians are so hung up on this concept of blaming and praising and punishing and this sort of like barbaric concept of retributive justice, this idea that people need to pay for their crimes. And really you should think in terms of trying to prevent crime and trying to rehabilitate people who've committed crimes and trying to make people more functional instead of telling them they're bad and wrong. And instead of praising people for their benevolent actions, you should try to figure out how to make a more benevolent society. So is there anything inconsistent about that? Well, they're suggesting you do something, right?
Well, yeah, it would suggest making a decision.
Yeah,
That
a
seems
free
like
decision
free
or
will.
a determined decision.
Yeah, I would say it'd be a free will decision to
Yeah.
be better than
Yeah.
what you were, but that could also be determined.
So this is the weird. This seems like that. If everything's fated, right? If I tell you, well, you should do X instead of Y, why would I do that? Because whatever you're going to do, whatever you're going to do. It's you're fated. You're determined. The outcome's already determined. So it's not as if I can change the outcome of the events by making a free will choice to inform you of your better options so that you'll make a free will choice, because it's all determined.
What about someone that like steps down from suicide after being talked to?
Well, then, like, whatever I suggest, I suppose, is determined, and whatever they decide is determined.
Yeah, okay.
So I can't make a difference in the outcome. Now, I suppose I might say, well, I'm determined to based on my makeup, I'm determined to try to talk you out of suicide, but you're going to do what you're going to do.
Yeah.
So I might change. I might be a cause which changes the outcome of your decision. But I mean, imagine someone who's contemplating suicide, and your advice to them is like, well, whatever you do is fated anyway, so don't worry about it. Or maybe you should worry about it. If you do worry about it, that will be part of the causes to lead to the inevitable result of you're either dying or not dying. And the only reason you don't know what you're going to do now is because you have imperfect knowledge. But there's only one thing that you're going to do. I just don't know what it is. Or I could try to predict it. I might say, based on your makeup and not everything you know about psychology, I would give you a 64% chance of survival.
I just started psychoanalyzing.
That's probably be the bad thing to talk about someone who's
Yeah.
contemplating suicide.
Yeah.
But it is a sort of weird paradox that determinists say, well, once we accept determinism is true, then we're gonna make all these social changes and we're gonna engineer the great society through, social engineering and everything will be sweetness and light. And it seems like that assumes the libertarian view. So that's the charge of inconsistency is it's sort of this thing here, saying this, it seems like it assumes free will. So since free will is an illusion, make this free will choice. And that might be a better way of putting, since free will is an illusion, make this free will choice. So that's the charge of inconsistency. To say, engineer.
But could engineering be putting in effect?
Social change into effect.
Yeah, I mean, it was
to predetermine all.
the term is to say, well, urging people to do social engineering is part of the cause that will bring about the greatest society. So even though I recognize, like, I'm urging you to do something, I'm having a causal effect on you, and you might respond to it and you might not. I don't know which it is. I suppose I hope that things turn out the way I expect them to, but my feeling of hope is also a product of previous causes. But it seems like it's really hard, like you always have to step back and say, well, on the other hand, they're just gonna turn out the way they turn out. To try to persuade someone of something seems to assume that you're trying to get them to make one choice as opposed to another. And it's different than like trying to cause them to do something. Like persuasion, and this is the idea, persuasion's different from coercion. Persuasion. Coercion. Like if I'm going to try to force or threaten somebody, those are different. Persuasion, I'm trying to rationally persuade someone to make one choice as opposed to another, based on morality, based on self-interest, based on the idea that they're what their goal is, and maybe try to show them that the way they're trying to attain their goal is a bad way, right? So I'm trying to give them reasons and evidence why they should adopt one belief or one course of action as opposed to another. That seems to assume free will and rationality, whereas coercion is as this idea of forcing someone to do something and taking away their free will. And the determinists will see these are just different forms of trying to make somebody do what you want them to. But it seems like there's a distinction between persuasion and coercion. And this comes out actually a good segue to compatibilism. Let's mention the other ideas of intuition, deliberation, and poor prediction. So these are all libertarian arguments. So the idea that your first experience is that from when you wake up in the morning you have control of your actions. If you have some bad habit you can't break, it clashes with your other, the rest of your experience. You're like, well, I generally have control over my life, but this one thing, like I can't stop smoking or I can't stop drinking or I'm perpetually late or whatever it is. Like if you have this bad habit you have, it's frustrating and you like wonder about it and you're wondering why you can't deal with this particular thing. And the reason why that particular thing bothers you is because the rest of your life you feel like you're calling the shots. So it seems like your first person experience is having control of your life. And if you feel like you don't have control, like people say, I feel like my life's spinning out of control, or I have no control over my life, people usually get into therapy. Everybody else are walking around and they feel like they're the ones in charge, that they're making free choices. And then when you're making a complex choice and you're deliberating, you're weighing alternatives, trying to figure out what you're going to do, it really feels like you're not just going through the motions, but that you could do one thing or you could do another, and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do. And then there's this idea that the social scientists are notoriously bad about predicting what people will do. The election of Donald J. Trump, just the latest in the series of like the experts being totally wrong about things, based on their assumptions about what people are going to do. And you get people who like with doctorates who like have like years of experience making predictions, and they got it wrong, and they'll do this. And this is dealing with like large groups of people, right? So imagine trying to predict what like an individual person will do. That's really tough. And people in groups, they generally you get better predictions, but they're still bad. So you can sometimes the polls are pretty close, and sometimes it depends on which polls you look at. But the idea of trying to predict what an individual is going to do seems like it's tough. Why? Because the libertarian will say because they're free, and you can't predict what a free person will do, or you can't predict what a person will freely do. Let's talk about compatibilism. So compatibilism is an attempt to solve the free will problem by changing the definition of free will. So their idea is that free will is not the power to have done otherwise under identical circumstances. Remember, that's the definition of freedom that both the determinists and libertarians say, that free will is the power to have done otherwise under identical circumstances. And they will say that free will is doing what you want to do. So it's the coincidence of capacity and desire. So the idea is that you have the ability to do a certain thing and you want to do it, and then you do it. That's a free choice. Another way of a qualifier here, doing what you want to do without coercion. So in other words, nobody's forcing you to do it. Nobody's putting a gun to your head and making you eat that cupcake, for example, right? So now suppose somebody really does point a gun at your head and say, eat that cupcake. Maybe they're jealous of your svelte figure. They want you to be morbidly obese like they are. And by God, they're going to hold you at gunpoint and make you eat like a whole tray of cupcakes. Right? So that's coercion, right? So when you coerce a person, you threaten them. You could, I suppose you could tie them up and stuff the cupcakes in their mouth one at a time, right? Or you could threaten them with death in case they eat the cupcakes. So that's like artificially restricting their choices to one extreme choice that any normal person will want to avoid, and something that's less bad, right? So that's a coercion. And I think I talked earlier about this Abbott and Costello sketch where one of the, I can't remember which one, whether it's Abbott or Costello, it's the short guy. the short funny guy, not like the tall, thin, angry guy. And he's being held up, I guess that's terrible, I can't remember which is which. Anyway, third base. So he's being held up, and then he says, your money or your life, right? And the guy, he's like, what? Come on, stop stalling. He's like, and the guy says, I'm thinking it over, right? So that's corny 30s humor, and the idea, why is that supposed to be funny? Well, like, your money or your life is not a choice you think over, right? So it's coercion. And if that robber were to like brought up on charges, and he's got like the guy's wallet, and he says, Your Honor, I'm innocent of the crime of theft because the man accusing me gave me his wallet of his own free will. I pointed a gun at him. I said, "Your money or your life," and he chose his life, and he handed over his wallet voluntarily. Right? That's not gonna wash, right? Because it wasn't. It's not voluntary if you're being threatened or coerced in some way, right? So the compatibles will say every choice you make is based on your desires, based on your heredity and your environment, and based on your desire. And all those things are caused. So they agree with the determinists that all your actions are caused. But those actions which are caused by you, namely a desire you have or a belief you have, it's either a reason or a desire. If it's a reason or desire that you have and you're not being forced and coerced, that's a free action. So those acts caused by your reason, meaning like you have a reason or desire, are free. Even though caused. And meaning they're determined. Causally determined. If, or as long as they're not coerced. There is no coercion. So like normal circumstances, I see some cupcakes, and I see those cupcakes are on sale. They're half off. They're chocolate cupcakes. And even though I'm trying to lose some weight, I see those cupcakes, I'm like, oh damn, those cupcakes look good. And they're on sale, right? So you look back at my causal history, you see like, I'm a cheapskate, and I just like have a strong desire to save money. I got, bumped from my full-time position. I'm on layoff, so I don't have a lot of money anymore. And so I'm there at the Walmart, and I see those cupcakes, I'm like, damn, those cupcakes look good. And they're chocolate. And like I have all these experiences of being a kid, getting cupcakes in school, having cupcakes as a treat, cupcakes as a reward. I have extremely positive association with cupcakes, more so than with like regular cakes or with cookies. Like cupcakes have a strong draw, right? So there's the cupcakes, and there's the fact that I'm a human being. Human beings crave sugar and fat. There's the place of chocolate in American society. There's food as a reward for kids when they're going to government school. There's like the addiction of sugar, the sugar and the fat, and the effect they have on the nervous system, right? So all sorts of, and then there's the fact that like, causes of like, eating bad food over a long period of time, those are remote, and they're gonna happen like later. Maybe I have a habit of procrastination. Like all those things are gonna lead up to the decision of me buying the cupcake. I want the cupcake, I buy the cupcake, right? I buy the whole tray of cupcakes, right? And so, and I buy like, and so because I desire to save money and because I like cupcakes, I buy the cupcake, and I'll take the hit to my health. Because maybe, again, other sort of things that happen to me as a child and my culture and my current circumstances. So, and these decisions I make are always going to be, there's always going to be like a million things involved. So there's going to be like a whole bunch of different cupcake. So there's going to be all sorts of different causes, right? But as long as the last thing here is want to buy, must have cupcake, right? as long as this is my desire, and my desire to buy a cupcake leads to me buying a cupcake, then it's a free action. Now, if somebody makes me buy the cupcake, like they say, buy that cupcake, or your cat gets it or something, right? Then that's not a free action. But as long as I'm buying the cupcake and I'm not being forced or coerced, then that's a free action. Even though it's cause, and even though I couldn't do anything else other than buy the cupcake. Yeah.
What if you're using something to bribe you, like if you buy a cupcake, you get an A in the class? Would that still be free will?
Yeah, so I think that's it's persuasion, and so
Yeah.
I think that the compatibles are going to say there's a difference between persuasion or enticement and coercion, and you might question that, right? So there's well, it's a sale, right? So if the cupcakes were $5, I might not have bought them, but they were $2.34. And so I'm like, that's pretty good for 6 cupcakes. So it's like 50 cents, less than 50 cents a cupcake. I'll buy the cupcakes there. If the cupcakes were $5, that's like $1 a cupcake. I'm not going to spend that kind of money for cupcakes, right? So they entice me with their low prices. Damn you, Walmart! Right? So the high cost of low prices. So, so that was and you might say that was part of the cause of my decision. Because the compatibilists are determinists, they'll say things are only going to turn out one way. But if I desire to buy the cupcake and it leads to me buying the cupcake, and nobody is making me do it, then it's different. So, and this is a question of enticement. Persuasion, because the compatibilists want to say that's okay, but coercion isn't. So the question might be where does coercion end and enticement and persuasion begin? Does this guy Cass Sunstein? He had another co-author, I guess it was listed first in the book, but they had this book called Nudge. And the idea is that the government should subtly manipulate you into not buying cupcakes, basically, and not shopping at Walmart. Go into your fair trade, organic vegetable, the vegan hut, and buying stuff there because it's better for you. And the government should have a tax on cupcakes or make that will make you not buy them as much, and make you and maybe have a subsidy for organic vegetables so you'll buy more of those. And there's a question about where does nudging or persuasion or enticing, I suppose, or where does nagging and manipulation begin, right? And how does that eventually turn into coercion or manipulation? Manipulation. Versus what you call because it seems like that's a form of manipulation. That's nudging. So at least that seems like an issue there that you might try to argue against the compatibilists with. This always happens. It happened of necessity. So the arguments against compatibilism. So compatibilism wants to do things. It wants to preserve moral responsibility, and also preserve science. So this idea of cause and effect as part of the scientific worldview, commitment to science. And the question is it successful? And the counter arguments are well, suppose you have some Manchurian candidate guy and you hypnotize him to want to bump off the president, and then he ends up doing it, right? If you plant a desire in his subconscious mind for assassination, right? That seems like the last thing in the causal chain is I want to kill the president. He pulls the trigger and he kills the president. This is just a hypothetical example. The Secret Service is in, right? So, so in the movie The Manchurian Candidate, you have a person who is hypnotized by the commies to try to kill the president of the United States, and if at that moment he desires to kill the president and then he pulls the trigger, it seems like it shouldn't be free will, like he's been brainwashed. But it seems like compatibilism will say, well, as long as that desire is there, then therefore his action is free. And it also seems that like you hypnotize someone to do anything, that would count as free if when they do that thing, they have a strong desire to do that, even if they've been hypnotized or brainwashed. So
Yeah, that's a little
hypnosis or brainwashing. And then there's this argument from Calvinism. It's in the text. I'd like you to look at that. It's a little complex. But basically, Calvinists say God predestines certain people to heaven and certain people to hell, and the people that he sends to hell deserve to go there because they're a bunch of sinners. Calvinism also says you were born in original sin and it was impossible for you not to sin. But nevertheless, you deserve to go to hell. And that's the problem. And the reason why most people don't accept Calvinists, even the Calvinists, even Christians, is because you get sent to hell. It seems like you could say, well, I was born with the original sin. How could I do otherwise? How can I be justly punished? If compatibilism were coherent, that would make sense, but it doesn't.